There is a small bronze plaque inside the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston that most visitors walk past without reading closely, tucked near the entrance to the exhibit space rather than at its center. Easy to miss if you do not already know to look for it. It marks the founding, in 1989, of the Profile and Courage Award, an honor given each year to elected officials who took a principled stand at real political cost, named for the book John F. Kennedy published in 1956 about senators who had done exactly that. The award was Caroline Kennedy's idea. She was 31 years old when she created it, a young mother building her own career in law and museum work, choosing, of all the ways she might have honored her father's memory, to build something that would require her to show up every year for the rest of her life. She has done exactly that for 37 years. In May of 2026, standing at that same podium, she used part of her remarks to say a different name, one that had nothing to do with the award itself. Most of all, we remember Tatiana. Her daughter had died 5 months earlier, at 35, and the sentence passed through the ceremony almost quietly, a private fact folded into a public occasion, delivered by a woman who has spent her entire adult life deciding exactly how much of her family's story belongs to the room she stands in and how much does not. That instinct, the deliberate construction of institutions as a way of managing what is otherwise unmanageable, may be the single clearest thread running through Caroline Kennedy's life, more revealing in some ways than the losses themselves. Where other public figures faced with repeated tragedy have processed it through memoirs, television interviews, or extended public reflection, Caroline has consistently chosen a different response. She builds something that outlasts the moment. The Profile and Courage Award is one example. Her sustained involvement with the Kennedy Library is another. Her ambassadorial postings, her books on constitutional law, her edited volumes of poetry and American history for young readers, all of it points toward the same underlying pattern: a woman who has metabolized personal loss by converting it into public structure rather than public narrative. To understand why she reaches for institutions instead of explanations, it helps to look at where that instinct came from, and it began, as so much of her life did, with her mother. Jacqueline Kennedy was 34 years old and 5 days shy of her own next birthday's distance from Caroline's when President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Caroline was 5. Her brother John was 3. In the days immediately following, it was Jackie, alone, who made the decisions that would define how the tragedy was remembered by the country and understood by her children. The choice of Arlington National Cemetery over Massachusetts. The eternal flame, the horse-drawn caisson modeled after Abraham Lincoln's funeral. An entire vocabulary of national mourning constructed in roughly 72 hours by a widow still in her 30s. It was, among many other things, an act of institution building performed at the worst possible moment of her life, and it set a template that her daughter would later follow in her own way. That grief, handled correctly, could be shaped into something durable, dignified, and useful to other people, rather than left as raw material for endless public consumption. The years that followed were not simple for either mother or daughter. Jackie moved the family first to Georgetown and then to New York, hired tutors, chose schools with unusual care, and worked to keep photographers and reporters at a physical distance that grew harder to maintain every year her children got older and more recognizable. Caroline attended the Convent of the Sacred Heart and later Concord Academy, schools selected in part for administrators willing to enforce boundaries against the press. She has said, across several interviews over the decades, that her mother was the greatest influence on her life, and she has been specific about why. Not because of any single conversation or piece of advice, but because Jackie demonstrated, through sustained daily behavior, that survival was possible and that the manner of that survival mattered as much as the fact of it. It is worth noting that this lesson arrived inside a family that had already absorbed a striking amount of early loss before Caroline was even born. Her father was the second of 9 children. The eldest, Joseph Kennedy Jr., died in 1944 when the experimental aircraft he was piloting on a volunteer bombing mission exploded over England. Kathleen Kennedy, known as Kick, died in a plane crash in France 4 years later, at 28. Caroline's Aunt Rosemary, who experienced developmental difficulties as a child, underwent a lobotomy in 1941 that left her permanently and severely disabled, a fact the family did not discuss publicly for decades. Caroline was born into a name that carried, alongside its extraordinary privilege, an unusually heavy private history of early death that most outside observers did not fully learn about until much later. Her uncle Robert Kennedy became something of a second father figure to Caroline and John after 1963, and his assassination in June 1968, while campaigning for president, arrived when Caroline was only 10. She has described, in later years, the strange doubling of that loss. A second violent political killing inside the same family within a single decade, absorbed by a child who was still working through the first one. The following July, her uncle Ted Kennedy survived the car accident at Chappaquiddick that killed Mary Jo Kopech, an event that did not take a family member's life, but permanently altered the family's public standing and, by extension, the scrutiny applied to every Kennedy child who came after. Ted became, over the following decades, the family's most visible patriarch and an informal guardian to Caroline and John, a role he held until his death from brain cancer in 2009, when Caroline was 51. Each of these events, whether or not they touched Caroline directly, shaped the environment she grew up inside, an environment where tragedy was not an aberration in the family's story, but a recurring condition she learned, from an early age, that people were expected to manage in public without visibly buckling under it. By the time she reached adulthood, Caroline had built a life with real substance of its own, distinct from the family narrative she had inherited. She attended Radcliffe College, graduating in 1980, and Columbia Law School, earning her degree in 1988. She worked as a consultant in the education department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, developing an interest in cultural institutions that would echo throughout the rest of her career. She co-wrote several works of constitutional scholarship with legal scholar Ellen Alderman, including In Our Defense and The Right to Privacy, serious books aimed at making legal history accessible without oversimplifying it. In 1986, she married Edwin Schlossberg, a designer and museum consultant, in a wedding at the family's Cape Cod home that her mother lived to see. They had 3 children, Rose in 1988, Tatiana in 1990, and John, known within the family as Jack, in 1993. For 8 years, Caroline built her adult identity in the orbit of her mother's particular strength, private, exacting, unwilling to perform vulnerability for public consumption, a strength Caroline had watched her mother deploy since she was 5 years old. In January 1994, Jackie was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. She was gone by May, at 64. The speed of it was, by the standards of that disease, unusually fast, and it arrived as the unmistakable end of the era that had organized Caroline's entire adult understanding of how a person survives loss. Jackie had been the anchor for 30 years, the person who decided, alone, how her children would be told about their father's death, and who had held the family's public presentation together through every subsequent wave of scrutiny. Her death did not simply remove a parent. It removed the architecture Caroline had relied on since childhood, and it left her, at 36, as the primary keeper of a story that had, until then, always belonged first to her mother. It was the following year, 1995, that Caroline founded the Profile and Courage Award, an act that reads, in hindsight, as a direct continuation of exactly the instinct her mother had modeled in 1963. Rather than simply mourning, build something that will require you to keep showing up, publicly, on a schedule, indefinitely. 5 years after her mother's death, in July 1999, Caroline's brother John died when the small plane he was piloting went down over the Atlantic en route to Martha's Vineyard, killing him, his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister Lauren Bessette. John had married Carolyn in 1996 in a ceremony so tightly guarded that its secrecy became a story in itself. He had founded George Magazine, his own attempt to build something separate from his father's legacy while still working inside its shadow, an ambition not entirely unlike his sister's later choice to found an award rather than simply write about their father. On the night of the crash, the weather over the Northeast was hazy, and John, though licensed, had limited experience flying in low-visibility conditions. The Coast Guard searched for 16 hours before locating wreckage. The bodies were recovered days later. John was 38. Of everyone in Caroline's life, he had understood something no one else fully could, having grown up inside the same photographs, the same fishbowl, the same inherited weight. Kennedy historian Stephen Gillen, reflecting on Caroline's life after Tatiana's death, observed that John was the only person who had shared the exact scale of what she lost as a child, and that losing him meant losing the one other living person who had lived that specific childhood beside her. By 41, Caroline was the last surviving child of John and Jacqueline Kennedy. The institution building continued alongside, not instead of, a genuine public career. Caroline served as United States Ambassador to Japan from 2013 to 2017, a posting during which she was widely credited with strengthening cultural and educational exchange between the two countries, and later as ambassador to Australia from 2022 to 2025. In 2008 and 2009, she was briefly and publicly considered as a potential appointee to the U.S. Senate seat vacated by Hillary Clinton's move to the State Department, an effort that did not succeed and that exposed her, for one of the few times in her adult life, to the kind of overtly political scrutiny her brother had faced more routinely. She withdrew her name before any formal decision was made and has rarely discussed the episode since. Throughout, she remained closely involved with the Kennedy Library's programming, fellowships, and archival work, and she wrote and edited books aimed specifically at younger readers, including collections of American poetry and civic history designed to introduce children to her father's ideals without requiring them to first absorb the full weight of his assassination. Colleagues who worked with her on those projects have described an unusual insistence on accuracy and restraint, a preference for letting primary documents carry emotional weight rather than dramatizing it further, the same instinct, again, that seems to run underneath nearly everything she has chosen to build across 5 decades of public work. It was into this family, and this pattern, that Tatiana Kennedy Schlossberg was born in 1990. She grew up in New York, attended the Brearley School, and graduated from Yale, where she studied history. She went on to write for the New York Times, covering environmental and climate issues at a time when the paper was expanding that coverage, developing a reputation among colleagues for meticulous reporting paired with an unusually direct, often wry voice. In 2019, she published Inconspicuous Consumption: The Environmental Impact You Don't Know You Have, tracing the hidden environmental costs embedded in everyday choices, from streaming video to fast fashion, in an attempt to make an abstract global problem legible in terms of daily life. She married George Moran, whom she met in college, in 2017, at the same Martha's Vineyard property where her parents had married in 1986 and where her Uncle John had celebrated his own wedding in 1996, land that had by then absorbed 3 generations of the family's most significant occasions, both joyful and eventually mourned. She had 2 children, a son, Edwin, born in 2022, and a daughter, Josephine, born in May 2024. Shortly after Josephine's birth, a routine blood test found an elevated white blood cell count. Further testing led to a diagnosis of acute myeloid leukemia, an aggressive cancer with a 5-year survival rate that hovers around 30% depending on subtype and treatment response. Tatiana was 34, with a 2-year-old son and a newborn daughter, at the exact moment in her life when she had the most reason to want more time. She underwent treatment over the following months, continuing to write when able, and remaining engaged with her family with what people close to her have described as unusual clear-eyed practicality about what she was facing, itself perhaps a family trait passed down through her mother and grandmother before her. In November 2025, Tatiana wrote about her diagnosis in an essay for The New Yorker, one of the most widely discussed personal essays published that year. She wrote about trying to stay present with her children when presence took deliberate effort, about organizing her remaining time around what she needed to say and do for them, and about the particular grief of a climate journalist who had spent her career documenting long-term consequences she now understood she would not live to see. She wrote about watching her cousin Robert F. Kennedy Jr. be confirmed to lead the Department of Health and Human Services, the private irony of watching a relative whose public skepticism about vaccines she had spent years professionally countering, while she herself depended on advanced medical treatment to survive. She wrote about her fear of what her illness would do to her mother, given everything her mother had already lost, and she wrote the sentence that has since been quoted more than any other from the piece: that she had spent her whole life trying to be good, to protect her mother, and never cause her pain, and that she now felt she had added a new tragedy to her mother's life that there was nothing she could do to stop. She died on December 30th, 2025, 5 weeks after the essay was published. The JFK Library Foundation's public statement was brief. Their beautiful Tatiana had passed away that morning and would always be in their hearts. Caroline attended the funeral at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola in New York with her husband and her surviving children, Rose and Jack. Tatiana's husband George was there with their 2 young children, 4-year-old Edwin and 2-year-old Josephine, old enough to sense something had changed and too young to understand what. Jack Schlossberg wrote publicly in the days afterward that heartbreak did not begin to capture what the family felt, describing his sister as smart and funny like their mother, thoughtful and brilliant like their father, a description that also captures, whether he intended it or not, what Caroline has managed to be for 6 decades in the face of one loss after another: present, composed, and quietly persistent. During the roughly 19 months between diagnosis and death, Caroline continued her public work largely without interruption, declining consistently to discuss her daughter's illness until she judged the moment right, and when she finally did, at that profile and courage ceremony she herself had founded 37 years earlier, she said what needed to be said, once, and continued with the program as planned. Jack Schlossberg announced a run for Congress in New York's 12th District in November 2025, shortly before his sister's death, carrying forward a family tradition of public service that both his mother and grandmother helped define in different ways. Jackie through preservation and memory, Caroline through the quieter, sustained work of institutions and diplomacy. Rose has kept her own work largely outside of politics and media, a choice Caroline has by all accounts respected as fully as she has supported her son's more visible path, treating both as legitimate ways of inheriting a legacy that has never come with one acceptable form or a single correct way of carrying it forward. Family friends have noted that Caroline has largely allowed her children to define their own relationships to public life, resisting the impulse she has said she recognized in her own mother to script how the next generation should carry the family's name forward. She has, by several accounts, been careful to distinguish between offering guidance when asked and imposing expectations that were never hers to set in the first place, a distinction that people close to the family describe as one of the more deliberate choices she has made as a parent, separate from, and in some ways harder than anything required of her as a public figure. The Profile and Courage Award itself offers a useful window into how deliberately Caroline built this particular institution. Recipients over the decades have included governors, senators, and local officials from both major parties, chosen specifically because their principled stand cost them something real, a primary challenge, a governorship, in some cases a career, rather than because the stand itself was popular or safe. Caroline has presided over nearly every ceremony since the award's founding in 1995, and colleagues who have worked on the selection committee describe her as an active, engaged participant rather than a ceremonial figurehead, someone who reads the finalists' records closely and pushes back when a nomination seems to prioritize fame over the specific, narrower definition of courage her father wrote about in 1956. That insistence on precision, on holding a concept to its original, demanding definition rather than letting it soften into a generic tribute to public service, mirrors the same discipline she has applied to her own public statements about grief. Say only what is precisely true, resist the temptation to inflate it for effect, and stop once it has been said. Her diplomatic postings followed a similar pattern of sustained, detail-oriented engagement rather than symbolic appointment. As ambassador to Japan, she was known for an unusually active public presence, visiting all 47 of Japan's prefectures during her tenure, a deliberate effort to extend beyond Tokyo's diplomatic circles into regions of the country that rarely saw high-level American engagement. She used social media extensively during that posting, at a time when few ambassadors did, to document cultural exchanges, disaster recovery efforts following the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, and youth education initiatives, building a public profile in Japan that outlasted her formal term and that Japanese officials have cited in describing the strength of the bilateral relationship during those years. Her later posting to Australia, from 2022 to 2025, continued that pattern of hands-on cultural diplomacy, with a particular focus on educational exchange programs and climate cooperation, an emphasis that people close to her have noted overlapped meaningfully with the professional focus her daughter Tatiana had built as a climate journalist. Two women in the same family independently drawn to the same set of global concerns from very different professional angles. The consistency of that instinct toward sustained institutional work over episodic public statement has not gone unnoticed by journalists who have tried, over the decades, to write comprehensive profiles of her. Several biographers have described the particular difficulty of the task. Caroline Kennedy is simultaneously one of the most photographed people in modern American history and one of the least willing to narrate, in her own words, what any of it actually felt like from the inside. Interview requests connected to major anniversaries. The 50th anniversary of her father's assassination in 2013, the 25th anniversary of her mother's death in 2019, have typically been granted sparingly and answered with the same measured restraint she has applied to nearly every other public appearance of her adult life. That restraint has occasionally been read by outside observers as distance or coldness, an interpretation that people who know her personally have consistently pushed back against, describing instead a private warmth and dry sense of humor that she simply declines to extend to journalists or television cameras. The gap between the public figure, composed and precise at every scheduled appearance, and the private person described by friends and colleagues has itself become a recurring theme in how she is written about. A reminder that the discipline she inherited from her mother was never meant to be a complete account of who she is. Only the specific portion of herself she has judged appropriate to share with an audience that has rarely been willing to leave her alone. That same instinct toward selective disclosure shaped how she handled the period surrounding Tatiana's illness. Colleagues at the Kennedy Library and at the State Department, where she maintained informal ties even after leaving her ambassadorial post, have described her as continuing to show up fully for scheduled obligations throughout Tatiana's treatment, rarely if ever explaining why certain weeks required rescheduling or why she seemed, at times, more tired than usual. Few people outside her immediate circle knew the specifics of what she was managing privately until Tatiana's own essay became public in November 2025, at which point the broader shape of what the family had been living through for over a year became clear to readers all at once. Even then, Caroline did not issue a statement of her own alongside her daughter's essay, choosing instead to let Tatiana's words stand without amplification or commentary, a decision consistent with the pattern she had followed her entire life. Allow the person closest to an experience to describe it in their own words, in their own time, and add nothing that was not asked of you directly, even when the silence that decision requires is itself difficult to sustain. The broader Kennedy family has, across 3 generations now, produced a wide range of responses to the particular burden of growing up under constant public observation. Some have leaned into visibility, building careers explicitly in politics or media that trade on the family name. Others have retreated from it almost entirely, choosing private careers and declining most public engagements connected to the family's history. Caroline's own approach has occupied a distinct third position, neither fully public nor fully private, but selectively institutional, willing to appear at scheduled, purposeful events tied to specific work, while declining almost everything that falls outside that structure. It is a position that requires constant, active maintenance rather than a single decision made once and left alone, and people who have observed her over decades describe the discipline required to sustain it as, in its own way, as demanding as any of the individual losses she has absorbed. That discipline extended, by all visible evidence, into how she prepared her own children for the same inheritance. Rose, Tatiana, and Jack were each raised with access to the family's historical weight, but without, according to people close to the family, any explicit pressure to build a public identity around it. Tatiana's path toward journalism, and specifically toward climate reporting rather than any subject connected to her family's political history, was often cited by those who knew her as evidence of Caroline's approach working as intended, a daughter free to build a career entirely on her own interests and her own professional merit, who happened, by her own account in later writing, to feel the weight of the family name mainly in private, in her determination not to add further difficulty to her mother's life. That same tension, a desire to build an independent identity while remaining acutely aware of what that identity meant to a mother who had already lost so much, runs through much of what Tatiana wrote in her final months. And it suggests that whatever Caroline intended to model for her children, at least one of them absorbed it with unusual clarity. There is a version of this story that could be told entirely through catalog, 5 losses arranged in chronological order, each one framed as further proof of a family cursed or a woman uniquely burdened by history. That version is not false, exactly, but it misses the part of Caroline Kennedy's life that seems, on the evidence of nearly 6 decades of public record, to matter most to her. Not what happened to her, but what she chose to do in response, year after year, appointment after appointment, ceremony after ceremony. The award still runs every spring. The library still operates, still receives visitors, still trains new fellows in the study of American public service. The books she edited for children are still assigned in classrooms that have no particular reason to know who compiled them. 2 ambassadorial postings produced working relationships and programs that outlasted her formal terms in both countries, the kind of institutional residue that rarely makes headlines, but that quietly persists long after the appointment itself has ended. None of that erases what she lost. It simply describes what she built instead of only mourning it. A body of work spread across 5 decades that exists independent of any single tragedy, and that will, by design, keep functioning long after the people who remember why she started it are no longer here to explain it themselves. That is, in the end, a different way of answering the same question her daughter's essay raised without quite asking it directly. What do you do with grief you cannot stop, that keeps arriving no matter how carefully you try to guard against it? Tatiana wrote that there was nothing she could do to prevent the pain her death would cause her mother, and she was right, in the narrow sense that no essay, no preparation, no amount of love could have stopped the disease itself. But Caroline had already spent most of her life demonstrating a different kind of answer to that same impossible question, one built not around prevention but around what comes after. Keep showing up, keep building the things that outlast any single loss, and let the structures you leave behind say what you have chosen not to say directly. She has been doing exactly that since she was 31 years old and founded an award in her father's name. She is still doing it now, 5 months after burying her daughter, and there is no visible sign, from anyone who has watched her closely across the decades, that she intends to stop, or that the discipline she learned as a 5-year-old girl in a white coat has weakened in any measurable way.